Okay. Okay, so where we left off last class was we were talking about the role of, lags and how we could think about dynamics in terms of static models with different time horizons. And we didn't yet talk about uncertainty. But uncertainty can play a really important role in lags as well. So for example, imagine that a company doesn't know whether the increase in the demand for its product is being driven by an increase in the demand for just its product, or being driven, which maybe could lead, be a very long-term thing, or whether it's being driven by something cyclical. So imagine that the Xbox demand surges a lot during Christmas time. A natural response by Microsoft is, rather than building new factories for that, just to borrow other factories to build during Christmas time, because they know it's just a Christmas boom and it won't last for a long time. However, imagine that this demand happened to come at Christmas time but actually lasts for a long time afterwards. Then Microsoft wishes that it had built factories, right? Because now it's got a lot more demand all year round that it has to supply. So it was sort of screwed up by the fact that it was used to this cycle during Christmas, and that confused it about whether it was seeing a permanent increase in its demand or just one of these cyclic increases in demand, right? If it had been in another industry, not video games, where there isn't such a big increase in demand during Christmas, it actually would have been better off, right? So it's sort of fooled by the cyclic nature of its industry to not see the permanent increase in its demand, right? So having cycles in the past can muddy your interpretation of changes in your demand and make you less able to respond quickly, right? More generally, your past experience will influence your interpretation. So broader information, not just observing the market itself, could influence your, what you do. Most companies probably look at their demand in the market, but they might look for other information to help them disentangle whether it was something going on in the market or whether it was just part of the cycle or whether there was a bigger trend for them. So Christian Hellwig has a really nice idea about this. So in macroeconomics, a very important question is why prices don't adjust. And one thing that people say is that it's hard to change prices. Prices may be durable, right? But those don't seem to be very large. And there's another cost you might think was durable, which is it might be costly to constantly be checking information in the newspapers about the state of the macroeconomy, right? So what you might want to do instead is just look at, is there a lot of demand for your goods, and use that to adjust your prices, right? But imagine that demand for people's goods tends to be something that shifts a lot around all the time, and companies don't want to permanently change their price just because the demand for their good went up or down for a brief period. Well, then that can create a big problem because people aren't reading the newspapers to check that it's something in the macroeconomy. They're just looking at their local demand. But if they think that that's a local fluctuation, then they're not going, that's only going to last a short period of time. They won't change their price in response to that. So together, frictions in the durability of price and the durability of information can make people not adjust their prices in response to macroeconomic shifts. Okay. So far during this dynamics discussion, I've been focused mostly on durable inputs, not on storable inputs. And now I want to consider a counterexample of oil. So oil can be stored essentially costlessly in the ground. And as a result of that, its price needs to rise at exactly the rate of interest. Does anyone want to try to say why that is? Yeah.
So if you can...
Miles, right?
Luke, actually.
Oh, Luke. Sorry, Luke.
So if you can draw oil out of the well for free and it costs nothing to leave the oil in the well, then if the price of oil grows less than the rate of interest, then I can simply pull the oil out, sell the oil, then get the money on the interest. And that's significantly better than me leaving it in the ground. And since everyone else knows that, the oil price goes up. In contrast, if it's less, then it's better to leave it in the ground because I would get more money. Yeah, but you can borrow the money today and still be able to pay back more than that in the future. Exactly. So what that means is a temporary shock to the price of oil
is going to move all prices of oil forever together. If a temporary shock happens in the price of oil forever is going to have to rise. Not if it rises at all, right? And that means, given that each year is only a tiny percentage of the whole life of oil in the future, it's unlikely to move prices by very much at all, right? And that means it's going to knock, that in order to stop the demand from, adjusting, the quantity is going to have to increase a ton if the demand temporarily increases by a lot, right? And this is the reason why gas prices actually are not much higher during the summer, even though the quantity of gas consumed is way, 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 way higher. The reason is that if the price of gas were to rise by a lot during the summer, everyone would dump all their gas from the future on those months, and that can't possibly happen, right? So even though the quantity increases by a ton, the price hardly changes. That means it's extremely elastic in the short run. But over the long term, right, if we just learned that the demand for oil for all the future was going to be higher, that would hardly change the quantity of oil consumed at all, right? Because there's only so much oil in the ground, and it's going to be consumed at some point. Right? So that means that the elasticity is very, very high in the short term and very, very low in the long term. Right? And that has interesting implications because the time path of carbon taxation therefore matters a lot. Actually, if you put a tax on carbon that lasts forever, it hardly makes any difference in terms of how much carbon is consumed. Right? Because the oil is going to be taken out of the ground at some point. The price of oil will just fall to fully offset that tax. But if you have a tax that's expected to be high now and low later, that will have a huge effect. Yeah, Luke.
But doesn't that assume that all the oil will be taken out? I mean, not all oil can be accessed cautiously. I mean,
so that's true. I mean, there is some elasticity. Like you can affect whether shale is drilled for and so forth. But in terms of the stuff that's in Saudi Arabia, there's just no way we're not going to burn that at some point. It's there, it's essentially free to pump it out.
I mean, if you assumed a sufficiently large carbon tax that was going to be applied forever.
It would have to be a massive, massive carbon tax, way higher than anything that anyone's seriously talking about. I mean, to get it down from $130 per barrel to zero. I mean, the carbon tax people are talking about are $5 a barrel. It would have to be $130 a barrel. So, yeah, Oliver.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say the tax on needs to be as high as the cost of the next best technology, right?
Yeah, which is basically the equilibrium price of oil or something like that, roughly. Okay, so oil and other exhaustibles are an extreme but important case. But I think there's a broader lesson here. In macro, you learn this whole story about the long-run supply curve for the economy being vertical, right? That depends on there being perfectly exhaustible people or whatever resources are that produce, right? And the question is, do you believe that that's actually true? I mean, basically, macro is putting us completely as if the aggregate economy is like this. If you produce more today, that has to be perfectly offset by producing less in some other part of the economy. There's only so much stuff. And that's totally inconsistent with the standard duration analysis, in which actually things are more elastic in the long run than in the short run, right? Maybe we believe this, maybe we don't believe this. If the aggregate economy is really like that, if it's really the long run supply curve is completely inelastic, even though the short run supply curve might be somewhat elastic, which is like the exhaustible resource model, then storability is at least as important in the aggregate economy as durability is, right? I mean, you could actually think of an opposite story like this. You could imagine that if we don't produce a lot today, then people won't invent technologies because the economy won't be being inventive. And then the long run, production will be way lower, right? If that were the case, that would be more like a durability type of an analysis. Then actually the long run supply curve would be more elastic than the short run supply curve, and the whole analysis that you learn in standard macro would be completely wrong. So, who knows if that's the case or not, but at least in principle it could be. And I think the more general point here is that anytime you're getting like some really strong result in economics, you should think, what is the assumption that's driving that result? Why do I think that things are more elastic in the long run than in the short run? Well, it comes out of some assumption you're making about intertemporal substitutes versus intertemporal complements, which is not magic, it's an assumption. And you almost never get something for nothing. Really, economics is not a set of results, it's a toolbox and a language for thinking about the world. And that's something that should be kept in mind. Okay.
So all these long-run natural output and then deviation from that are all based on this concept of that it's actually pretty exhaustible.
Exactly. It's based on the intuition that if you use something up now, that it can't be used up tomorrow.
So,
I mean, that's the argument that people informally give in macro. But you could think of another model of the economy where if you don't use it up today, then you can't use it tomorrow. Right? Like people lose their skills, for example, if they're out of work today. In that case, actually, like a long-term Keynesian policy is more important than a short-term one. So I mean, it's actually like a lot of these assumptions that you learn they're implicit, and you hear some very quick argument for them. But it's not at all clear that that's really true. Like the productive capacity of the economy could be permanently reduced by a temporary demand shock if it reduces invention, if firms exit the market and can't re-enter. You see what I mean? Any durable thing. This is, I think, the beauty. This is why I love preparing these types of lectures, because if you bring together two different literatures, that people are completely sure that things are one way in one literature and completely sure that they're the opposite way in the other literature, and you bring them together and you realize, oh my God, these are totally inconsistent with one another. Like, how do I reconcile these things? That's what teaching forces you to do, because you have to like actually teach both things to your students. And then you're like, oh crap, they're going to ask me why things are completely opposite in these two different things. And maybe you actually come up with some pretty interesting economic ideas that way. So, okay. So today we're going to, the last class and spilling over a little bit into this class, we talked about individual firms. But now I'm going to try to think about moving to industries rather than individual firms. And we're going to focus on where the rents that firms earn come from and how they're distributed across firms. We'll talk about rents that arise from barriers to entry. We'll talk about natural versus unnatural barriers to entry, of talent as a leading cause of rents, the properties of the distribution of talents, and that will lead us into a discussion of power laws and Zipf's law as empirical regularities. Okay, so now let's talk about how firms, about the profits that firms earn and what determines these. So if the price is here, and this is a firm's, marginal cost curve, the profits that they earn are this area in here, right? And what determines that area is obviously it's the area to the left of the supply curve at the equilibrium price. And that says that the more that a firm produces, sort of all other things being equal, the more profits it's going to make. But it's also true that the wider range of prices at which they would be willing to produce, the greater will be the profit that they make, right? Another way of saying this is that the more efficient is are they on average, compared to how efficient they are at the margin, the more profit that they're going to make, right? Because the ratio of this to sort of the average over here is going to be very important to determining their profitability, because they always set their marginal cost equal to the price, right? But of course, other firms help determine prices. And so what really matters is how efficient everybody's marginal cost is relative to this firm's average cost. In other words, how much better you are on average compared to how everyone is at the margin will determine how profitable you are. And this means that there are two basic sources of rent under competition. One is that you are able to stretch your marginal product further and therefore produce more than other people, and that you're better than other people at producing on average, and thus you'll be in high demand. So an interesting thing that this says is that being stressed out is actually a very good thing. Anyone who is very productive is going to necessarily be stressed. What do I mean by stressed? If your marginal cost, that is how productive you are on the margin, is way lower than your average productivity, I think that's a good definition of someone being stressed out or being overwhelmed, right? Because they're being pushed to the point where the next unit of their time is much less productive than the average unit of their time, right? But that's exactly, in a competitive market, what is equivalent to being highly profitable, right? So if you're stressed out, if you're in so high demand that you're being worked to the point where you're no longer all that productive, that's a good sign. That means that you're someone who's very valuable, right? And you can see that just in lots of examples, right? The best doctors are the ones who work the longest hours because they're being pushed to the point of their marginal product just being equal to the price. The best restaurants are completely packed because they're being pushed to the point, et cetera, et cetera. The most talented people are constantly turning down opportunities. If you're less talented, you don't have as many opportunities and you're less stressed out, right? Okay. So, a natural question is that the profits that people earn should naturally attract more people to enter into the industry, right? And this is a very classical idea that in the long run, if there's free entry, there should be no profits. Only short-term advantages yeah, go ahead. What's your name again? Jose.
Sorry, back to your idea about the marginal cost. So that's the idea that the marginal cost is like on the minimum of the average cost curve?
Yeah.
So you say stressed out is like being there?
No. So it's when you don't earn any profits if you're producing at the minimum of your average cost curve. You only if you're beyond that point. So it's precisely by being stressed out, by going beyond that most efficient point, that you are able to earn profits.
Yes, of course, but in that case, everybody's stressed out because nobody will be in that.
Well, not everybody is the same, right? You're assuming that everybody has the same technology. But as we'll see, the main source of profits is that not everyone has the same technology. If everyone had the same technology, then this argument would be true, right? So only short-term advantages would allow you to earn profits. So like a great example of that is the California gold rush. As soon as people were making money in California, because everyone could easily imitate them, people rushed in and nobody made any money, right? Another example of this is Groupon. Groupon really didn't have very much of additional value. So while they made a short-run profit because they were ahead of everybody else, everyone else rushed in and they basically went out of business. Or they're struggling along, but they're doing very poorly, right? Another thing is that if one firm is doing better than another, then other firms will switch their technology to imitate that firm. I'm getting low battery on here, by the way, Mike.
Sorry?
I'm getting low battery on here.
Okay.
Newspaper, they said that the continued existence of edible arrangements refutes the fundamental principles of the market. I don't know if you guys know what edible arrangements is. Raise your hand if you know what edible arrangements is. Is edible arrangements, let me see if I can show you a picture of them.
They live in Hyde Park, right? So
Yeah, they do. That's an edible arrangement. So it's like crappy fruit dressed up as a crappy bouquet of flowers, right? So, and what they said is that, the fact that edible arrangements is still in business, like, disproves the fundamental logic of the market, like this, right? That any time a firm has, like, is producing something that nobody wants, that they will exit the market, right? The long run, as a result of this, the long run supply curve should be flat at the minimum of the average cost curve, where the average cost curve is defined over all possible technologies that you could use in the market. And every firm in this view is just viewed as one of these short run technologies. Yeah.
Are you making a joke, or are you making like a point about
I was trying to illustrate the theory by a joke about what's very inconsistent with the theory.
But they're not making losses every year? Or...
No, I don't think so. I just think that they should be, or maybe they are, or maybe they are, and they're a money laundering operation. I think that's sort of what a lot of people were suggesting. In fact, in Rio de Janeiro, if you go down the street, on every street corner, there is a mattress store. Now, in New York City or any reasonable city, mattress stores, like maybe there's one for like each big area of the city. There's no way there's a mattress store on every corner. So you know that has to be sort of money laundering. And like in the same way, I sort of think that edible arrangements must be money laundering. Because I just can't believe that there's that many people who want this crap. Okay, so is Adam's son here? No? So you don't quite need the average, long-run average cost curve in this case to be completely flat. Because if there's a small number of firms and entry is efficient when there's a non-trivial quantity, then demand has to grow like a certain amount before the next firm enters the market. And as the number of firms grow, so does the elasticity without entry. So you basically have a picture like this where, up to a certain amount, the most efficient thing is for there just to be one firm in the market. But then another firm enters and another firm enters, and you see this thing gradually gets flatter and flatter. However, the fact that that you need a certain scale before the next firm enters the market, and therefore a firm runs up its cost curves, is not all that consistent with the assumption of perfect competition. Because in that case, each individual firm is going to have some market power that it can hold out to reduce its quantity, because things won't be as efficient otherwise. And so these types of integer problems are much more relevant when there's imperfect competition than when there's perfect competition. So here's the picture of what happens. Initially, there will be some higher slope, and as more and more firms enter, it gets flatter and flatter and closer to a flat long-run average cost curve. Okay, yeah.
But the perfect competition assumption doesn't really come from the number of firms. One way to justify it would be that there are like so many firms that you're very small related to the market. But if there is like a threat from other firms that enter the market, you could still get perfect competition. Maybe. Without being like many.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, it depends whether you buy that logic of contestability or not. I think it's hard to believe in perfect competition when people aren't a small part of a large society. I mean, it might be approximately in some sense, but it's not going to, Yeah, Kevin.
What's the reason that each of the pieces of the supply curve start at the same price?
Because that's sort of like the law. I mean, they don't really. Like, they would, this one would like, actually, that might be right. I mean, it's really the long run curve is sort of in the middle of this thing rather than in. I think that this is just where things drop down to once another firm enters. But this thing, it's not exactly, I mean, the idea is that it's flattening out to this entry point. So it's eventually getting there. I don't think it generically always has to start at exactly the same point. Okay, so the process of competition can be inhibited by government policies. So, for example, either government intervention or private violence can create barriers to entry. Matt, Mo? Is Matt here? No? Does anyone else want to give some examples of barriers to entry? Ari.
I know in airlines, one of the barriers to entry is like gate licenses.
Yeah. Yeah, so you have to have a license in order to be able to fly out of a certain gate, and that comes from like FAA regulations. Doctors have lots of barriers to entry. You have to like go through physics and chemistry. I don't know if anyone here is pre-med, but physics and chemistry and all this BS in order to become a doctor and spend your life sewing people. So you probably should have gone to sewing school instead of spending years learning chemistry and all that stuff. And taxi drivers have these medallions that limit the entry. There's other licensed occupations that are like that. Regulatory barriers, compliance barriers, like you might have to, in order to be a firm in an industry. There's a great example. The Republicans recently were trying to, in many states, pass regulations that in order to be an abortion clinic, you need to have like an MRI and you need to have like really, really clean, all this sort of requirements that people who are actually interested in women's health don't think are necessary. But it's like a way to like basically create barriers to entering that market and reduce the amount of abortions, right? Another example can be private violence. So like Mexican drug cartels are mostly in the business of killing people who try to enter the business of being a Mexican drug cartel, not in the business of producing cocaine. And so that's another barrier to entry, can be private violence. Or even petty harassment and bigotry. Like in many black neighborhoods, Asian stores find it very hard to enter because they get harassed by the black residents who don't like having Asians owning stores in their neighborhoods. That happened to a lot of Jewish stores and vice versa in dominantly white neighborhoods. Another thing that can do it is contractual arrangements that are anti-competitive. So for example, in Peru, what happened when they had free trade with the United States, it was a great blessing to them. The United States companies, SAB Miller in particular, came in and bought up all the Peruvian beer brands and raised the price. So what they got, the free trade that they got, was that someone else had enough money to cartelize their industries. That was the nature of competition from the United States. And then what they did is they signed agreements with all the beach posts in Peru. So like, there's lots of beaches in Peru and people go and they drink beer on the beaches in Peru. And so they signed deals so that they would be exclusive with these companies that they had and no foreign competitors would be able to enter the Peruvian market. And it was very hard to enter because something like 50% of beer in Peru is consumed on the beach or something like that. And so they couldn't achieve, scale without having access to those points. So that's another way to keep people out of the market. And these are usually created by lobbying, violence, and sometimes by these anti-competitive agreements, right? And economists call these activities rent-seeking activities. And we generally view them as bad for three principal reasons. Is David Wilson here? No? Anyone else want to say the reasons that rent-seeking is bad? Connor, yeah.
Well, it's just inefficient, making use of other people, the person providing the rent is wasting resources by doing that.
They're wasting resources by the investment that they make. That's one important reason. Other reasons? Yeah, Kevin.
It'll probably cause them to produce a quantity that's not socially optimal.
Yeah, they'll produce less because they're keeping out people who might be more efficient. What's your name?
Saad.
Saad?
Yeah. You can end up privileging certain groups over others.
Yes, you can end up benefiting the favored group, which might be less socially desirable than the consumers who you might take money away from. Okay. The first of these reasons, I think, is by far the most important reason why we worry about these types of barriers to entry, because the other effects occur even with intellectual property, which is something which the government actually enforces, right? So what we really must be worried about is that the money spent to try to acquire this is wasted rather than beneficial. Without some sorts of patents, trademarks, copyrights to prevent entry, profits from new innovations would be driven to zero, in some cases at least. Yeah, Luke.
But isn't that fundamentally questionable in the sense that wealth transfers are, they're neutral. No one's benefited or harmed by a wealth transfer necessarily.
Well, the first reason was not a transfer. This was effort expended that wastes the profits that come in from the barrier to entry.
But doesn't the waste usually come from the inefficient restriction on supply?
No, I think that's a mistake. Actually, I think the most concern people have is that people will waste a lot of money on lobbying, waste a lot of money killing other people to keep them out of the market, etc. That's the concern I think people have, not as much the restriction of supply. Even though a lot of people focus on that, I think the more important issue is the incentives that it creates. And those can be good or bad. We'll talk a lot about that in the intellectual property lecture. Okay, so what makes entry barriers good or bad depends on where the rents go. Exactly as we were just discussing. So rents to mafias, because of the value they get from keeping people out of the market, are very bad because they encourage violence. Rents to academic prestige, because you're the only one who's the expert who's allowed to talk about quadratic voting or whatever, could actually be good because it gives me an incentive to create an idea like that, right? Yeah. What's your name?
Albert.
Albert. Yeah.
What happens if like some academia that they actually screw up the data so they can create something that's significant or it's not significant at all? They change the data or something like that?
Yeah, I've heard that happens in China sometimes. Yeah, so like something like 50% of Chinese articles are supposed to be fraudulent. It happens all over the place in general, but I've heard it's particularly bad in China. So yeah, I mean, obviously you can create incentives for bad things through these things too. It's not always good. As we talked about, if it's easier to verify that you wrote an article than it is to verify whether the article is actually true or not, then you can create an incentive to create a lot of crappy articles as well. I think generally peer review does a pretty good job on that, but only at the top journals. So yeah, Lancelot.
Isn't there something also like Rentseeking, which is that it's sort of discrete in the sense that either you have the rent or not, and so it sort of creates a huge incentive because it's not like marginal. It's not like I'm going to kill one more person and I'm going to get like a little more profit. It's like I need to kill like 100 person. And then I'm going to get the rent, and so there's like a...
Yeah, maybe. I mean, a lot of arguments are that like most of these rents end up getting dissipated. It all depends on the elasticity of entering into the industry. But yeah, it all depends on, like how easy it is to become someone who vies for that. If it's very hard to become someone who vies to, get into the drug industry at all, then it will be just captured as a rent rather than dissipated in violence because there won't be anyone to kill to try to compete for it. So.
But isn't it like one rent and then once like the war is over, like one people, like, or is it like discounted future possible rents that you can get?
It could be both. I mean, again, as we talked about, static models are just temporal collapsing of dynamic models, right? So, in some sense, those are sort of, you could view them as similar for certain purposes, right?
It's just because you say that probably not all rents.
They don't necessarily all go to the same person. Like, you could get the monopoly. Once he gets in, he can keep all the rents forever, but maybe not. Maybe he can only keep them for 1 year, and then someone else will come in. That's
what I mean is that, for instance, like for like a patent,
yeah,
for medicines, it's not like you have two companies researching about like the same kind of cure.
Yeah,
it's not like they're both gonna get half of the rent. Like the really is gonna be one that is gonna have like the patent, and so it creates like a more wasteful incentive.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not completely.
Spend a lot.
I'm not completely sure that's true. If both of them got half, then they would both waste half. I mean, it all depends on what it's true. If it's only socially valuable to have one, not to have two, then it makes it particularly wasteful to do that. But it all depends on what's the social value of the investment they make along the way. If the investment they made along the way was generally creating like beneficial social effects, then that wouldn't be more wasteful. You'll have to think about what sort of activities are encouraged by the existence of that rent. So like, for example, rents for authentic art, like everyone wants to have the authentic art piece. They don't want even a perfect rip-off of the authentic art piece. Why? I don't know. It's something that's been programmed into us that it's like prestigious to have the authentic art, but that might be good because that creates incentives for people to pay a lot of money to the original artist, which gets people to innovate new art pieces. Yeah, go ahead, Oliver.
So, I mean, I guess the way you normally think about things like intellectual property and whatnot is you think you're sacrificing like short-term efficiency in some sense for the long-term dynamic.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk a ton about that in intellectual property lecture. That's what it's all about. So, another question is, are rents for drugs at the end of people's life actually beneficial? So, a lot of people would say yes, because they keep people alive and so forth. But I think that the big problem comes from the fact that we're spending way too much money on, as a society, on keeping people alive in enormous suffering for the last few days of their lives. And I think the reason has to do with like a crazy dynamic that we have between parents and children, where basically the parents want to die peacefully, and the children don't want to spend a bunch of money just to make their parents suffer. However, the parents think that if the child doesn't insist that they stay alive, it means the child doesn't love them, right? And so that creates this dynamic where the child is forced to force their parents to stay alive in suffering. And I think that's a mess. And so one potential solution that I think would be very populist would be to say, look, you have a right to earn a profit on something like Viagra. That's fine, or some, thing for younger people. But something at the end of someone's life, you have no right to exclude them via patent from, getting that at a cheap price. And that sort of populist demagoguery would sound really good, but what it would in the end do is undermine all the profits that people could make by developing drugs like that, and therefore shut down the market for those types of end-of-life treatments.
So,
yeah, Oliver.
In America,
yeah,
those kind of drugs would be paid for by Medicaid or by like...
Yeah. A lot of them are paid for by Medicaid. I mean, some of them are paid for by the individual. But basically what everyone who's not like incredibly rich does is they try to make themselves destitute before a certain age, and then they have Medicaid take over all their treatments.
But this is so like the individual, both the parents and the children have no incentive.
Well, sometimes it's not true. Sometimes they do have some residual incentives. I mean, there's some co-insurance in these things, and but okay. So, regardless of whether these things are good or bad, these barriers are sort of extra market. They're things that are imposed by the government or by some form of private violence. And this traditional assumption is that the market left to itself would basically eliminate profits. And this is one of the deepest and most cited ideas in economics, and it's quite useful and right in some contexts like intellectual property. But actually the number of contexts where I think this is the right way of thinking about things is much more limited than it might appear. And in fact, the rest of the lecture is going to be devoted to like some of the limits on these notions of free entry. And the basic problem with the notion of free entry is it doesn't take into account the fact that many activities require someone to have some rare talent. If it's really something that sort of any idiot can do, and any idiot can like implement the optimal technology, then sure, free entry will drive out profits, but this is only possible in limited circumstances. For example, you could say, well, it was so profitable to be Steve Jobs. Why isn't there free entry to being Steve Jobs? It's so. What's that guy who they always have all these like sayings about? Oh gosh. What? No. There's some character from like the movies where there's like this whole list of sayings where it's like, some people get bit by rattlesnakes. This guy, Chuck Norris, did you say Chuck Norris? Oh, you did. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so it's like, why isn't there free entry into being Chuck Norris? I mean, or LeBron James. I mean, obviously they have talents that can't easily be replicated, right? And because those talents are scarce, there's not free entry into it, and it commands a rent, right? And, you could say this is a barrier to entry, but there's nothing artificial or imposed from outside about it, right? So free entry really requires or means the absence of the need for talent in a given activity, right? And when a key factor in whether or not talent is necessary is how broadly you define the relevant industry. So in the long run, profits on touchscreen smartphones have turned out to be not that large. Apple only got a temporary advantage in that market, and eventually competition has come in, and now the iPhone is not really doing that well and is having to compete on price and so forth, right? But then Apple introduced the App Store, right? And so now they're a little bit ahead on that. That's really what's keeping the iPhone going. But even that people entered on, right? But then Apple introduced the iPad. And now that they no longer have Steve Jobs, who's constantly introducing all these completely paradigm-changing products, maybe they will fall behind, right? Really, their advantage was not like the profits they earned on any individual product, but always being one step ahead of the market. That's really what they earned the rent on, right? So narrowly defined technical processes are usually imitated. For example, Nokia's edge in the cell phone market didn't last for long because it was too easy to reproduce those crappy crappy cell phones, pre-smartphone cell phones. American car companies quickly got out competed by the Japanese, and so did legacy airline carriers. But broader industries are defined by the new products that are constantly being introduced. Is Joachim here?
Yes.
Yeah, Joachim. Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah.
So what are some examples of industries that you think are defined by these constant introductions of new products?
Well, yes, web technologies could be one.
Mm-hmm.
Anything to do with where the large fraction of investment in the company is into technology.
Yeah, that's right. So Intel, I think, is a great example of this. So, like, even Intel, which at this point seems pretty routine, not nearly as innovative as other companies, Intel's whole business model is Moore's Law, which is that every 18 months their processor power has to double. Just to stay in the market, they have to be doubling their processor power every 18th month. And even that seems like a pretty standard thing to do. You know what I mean? Google has this constantly expanding empire. The way they stay afloat is just constantly introducing totally new product offerings, right? Microsoft sort of lost the battle because they thought they could sit on just being the operating system company and not owning search, and they tried to rest on their laurels, and they now are trying to catch back up, right? So those types of innovation machines are hard to imitate. It may be possible to imitate one of their ideas pretty soon, but to imitate the process that they use to stay on top is very, very hard. So even in a narrow industry where prices do come down over time, it's not always that they come down over time by new people entering and imitating the existing firms and driving out their profits. Often, technology can make it so that the absolute top people are able to reach everyone and steal all the profits that way. And that can be the way that prices come down over time. And that doesn't eliminate profits at the top and spread them or reduce them for everyone while spreading them out. It actually concentrates them more and more at the top and eliminates them below. So that leads to lower price, better quality, but more rents for the people at the absolute top and unemployment for everybody else. So Kevin, could you give some examples of that?
Sure. So I guess one example would be like TVs.
Yeah.
Sort of allow really good actors to reach a wider audience rather than really going to the local theaters and watching
Yeah, that's a great example. Another example is, where you really see the temporal adjustment of this is the music industry during the baby boom. So during the baby boom in the United States, there was a huge amount of demand for popular music. And one could have thought that would have been a great thing that would have led to entry into the music industry, into the industry of being a musician. But actually, it led to a total decimation of the industry of being a musician, except at the very top. The number of people in the industry of being a musician went way down during that period. And the reason is that precisely all that demand created this pop culture machine, which created, and the radio and all this sort of stuff, a lot of that came in response, the way that it was organized came in response to the baby boom. But the way that that all those technologies did was to create a few stars at the absolute top, which in turn put out of business all the local musicians. Professional sports during the 20th century, the greater demand for sports actually reduced the number of people who were playing sports professionally, because it created a whole infrastructure of these huge sports teams in big cities that were seen over the TV and so forth, and that put out of business all the local teams that could support themselves a little bit by sales of local games. The fast food revolution is another thing like this. The need to feed all these kids created, rather than more restaurants, fewer restaurants in a certain sense, because McDonald's was able to more cheaply, for a given level of quality, serve lots of people. This also happens with gourmet food and celebrity chefs, where the increased demand for gourmet food you might think will lead to a lot of new restaurants, and for a while maybe it does. But then celebrity chefs come in and try to mass produce the gourmet food experience. Rick Bayless tries to take over all sorts of stuff. Did you have a question?
Going back to the
What's your name again?
Franklin.
Franklin. Yeah.
Going back to the fast food thing, you mentioned McDonald's. Would this apply to basically anyone who can get tremendous economies of scale, like say Walmart pushing mom and pop stores?
Exactly. Anytime you can innovate by having one of the best people reach tons and tons of people, you'll have this superstar effect. And you'll have this adjustment by actually more concentration of rents at the top, not by competition driving things down. Another example is mass production of designs during the 1950s. So the increase in people's wealth during the 1950s and the increase in the middle class led to a mass desire for design. And rather than that leading to more people being designers, it led to a few people doing designs that could be spread all over the country. And I think that this is actually the future of education and medicine. So I think actually the increase in the demand for education from the developing world is not going to lead to more professors. It will actually lead to fewer, because it will lead to all these MOOCs, and then the few professors will be able to spread their message throughout more people. And similarly in medicine, I think that the greater demand whereas the internet is like a structure that's more adapted to people having heterogeneous niches. I don't know that would have been completely predictable, but that's the way it's turned out. Yeah, Vidur.
The other thing, I guess, when I think about that is that the internet can also sort of proliferate this superstar effect. So if you look at soccer leagues, the English Premier League has become so much more recognized globally than a lot of the other European or smaller leagues.
Yeah, in that case it's more like mass media rather than being this niche thing. So yeah, I mean it's complicated to predict which way things go. Yeah, Jack.
It sounds like there are two very distinct effects.
Yeah.
On the supply side, you've got technology changes that allow professors and comedians to have a much lower percentage, but on demand side, I think things like the music industry driven boom would have been possibly like social multipliers, never. Because if I like this band, I want my friends to like this band, so we can talk about it, and there's a lot more of that goes on. I think it's not just the size of the demand increase, it's the nature of it.
No, that's true. It depends on both the demand and the supply side technological conditions, which way things adjust.
So the question you asked would be something like, are the distribution costs falling faster than the entry costs, or vice versa? That's all determining where you get more.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, what's your name?
Russell.
Russell, yeah.
What kind of things do you see superstar doctors being able to do, like through the iPad? Because I've heard of like people being able to do ultrasounds like to India from haptics and stuff.
Yeah.
But I feel like you wouldn't need a superstar.
Okay, so here's the way I think the medical industry will work in 20 years. I think that all diagnosis will be done in an automated way, and that what doctors will have the job of doing is collecting the data that comes in from those iPads and deciding how to analyze it to come up with the right protocols to send back to all the iPads around the world, and then randomly assigning, doing some like randomized assignments of treatments to people when you're close to indifferent in terms of what treatment you should give them, and then using the results from that to make. I think that basically there's going to be like a room or like a bunch of universities filled with people like controlling all the data that's coming from the iPads and sending back out to the iPads instructions of like what to diagnose people with.
So like instead of me sitting in the room with my doctor and you go like, I guess I'll have physical therapy instead of surgery, they just like flip a coin.
Well, exactly. It's like, it's exactly what Google does. It's like, like the doctors are to the medicine of the future what librarians were to Google. Like, do you really want someone to sit there with you and be like, if I'm looking for this, like, where should I look? And she goes through the books. She does it slower and she does it less well. And, I need physical contact to get my information. Like, why? It makes no sense. I know everyone's like used to things some way and they just assume things are going to be that way because they're used to it. But it just makes no economic sense. Okay, so to analyze this, Chad Severson took a creative approach. So because it was hard to compare sort of like the short run and the long run, what he tried to do is like look at markets that were larger and smaller, because the larger markets would look more like they would make more investment in being like the long-term equilibrium. There would be sort of more competitive pressure there. And he tried to look at whether that led to more entry, more firms, or whether it led to more concentration among the best firms. And the way he tried to look at this was look at markets with lower transportation costs so you could reach more people, and then compared these dense markets versus like the looser markets that couldn't sort of communicate as well with each other. He focused on a very narrow, simple industry of concrete, where it was very easy to measure transportation costs, productivity, size of firms, etc. And he found that the superstar effect was substantial. And in particular, he showed that basically, if you look at the dense market, if you look at the markets that are very dense, you have a lot more productive firms than in the markets that aren't dense, because you select out these people who can reach more people. Rather than more people coming in who are slightly less productive, you concentrate things into the top, most productive firms. And there's in fact a large trade literature built around this idea. And a natural question that comes out of this is, in what cases will entry, and in what case will like increasing the communication dominate the response to a supply shock? Okay, so a basic assumption of the free entry model is that entry is durable. That is, that in the short term you might be able to have an advantage, but in the long term more firms will enter into the market. And yeah, Arvid.
Just on one point on superstars, is it because essentially a few superstars take over, but it's because they have that a lot more talent, like with Zipflaw, that they're just a lot more talented in what they do. Like you want this really good doctor like to diagnose you through the iPad, rather than this mediocre doctor like diagnosing the life. Like with the designers in the clothing industry, like Is that why there's so few? Because they have like substantially more talent, like with the actors?
So I've actually come to have the opposite view. My view has come to be that like almost every case that you find where people are like viewed as where talent follows Zipf's law comes from something involving the superstar effect, and almost everything where you have like a thin-tailed distribution of talent ends up coming from something that could easily have been Zipf's law, but where you had a different technology. So, for example, think about car drivers. If you think about like driving a car as an everyday thing, that's something that has a very thin-tailed distribution. Like you get better at driving a car, and at some point there's just not that much better that you're going to get. But race car drivers clearly have Zipf's law in terms of like their talent distribution. But that's just because everyone's looking at them, right? And so like the little differences get magnified. And I think if you think about almost every area where you think of it having a fat-tailed distribution of talent, if you think about doing that in everyday life, you'd realize that actually it has thin-tailed distribution of talent for everyday purposes. But when you put something in a certain technology, then it has a fat-tailed distribution. Another example of that, I think, is like...
It's amplified? That those small differences make like this...
So the usual model of Zipf's law is like this thing of, you know, the tails just end up looking like Zipf's law and so forth. But I don't think that that's actually right. I think there's got to be some better model that has to do with the nature of the technology and how it allows things to be selected out. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I think that's got to be the right explanation for Zipf's law in most cases. Because, so like, physical beauty, I think, is a great example of this. If you just like reflect on it, like someone who's very beautiful and someone who's like the most beautiful person you've ever seen, like the difference between them is not actually that big, like just from like the physical experience you have. But if you look at like supermodels, like the difference, you know, in terms of the money that the absolute top supermodel makes versus someone who's even slightly below her, really it like looks much more like a power law. And the reason is that top supermodel is able to reach so many people, so that little difference makes a big difference. You know what I mean? And that leads to this power law. Whereas it's very thin-tailed when you actually think about the effect that it would have on you physically in person. So.
Because that's also like with LeBron and all these suckers, it's just that little marginal being better, like 3 points in a game.
Yeah. But it gets magnified, and then they follow this power law. So this is the thing. I think power laws have to come from some feature of the technological situation rather than the actual, you see what I mean?
Than the actual...
Yeah, distribution. Yeah.
Well, that power law article was saying that you needed like frictions always in order to derive Zipf's law. That if you didn't have any frictions whatsoever.
But I don't think it's frictions here. I mean, I think that there probably is some mathematical thing of this where, like, you know, if... Yeah, I don't know exactly what it is, but it's like if you're really caring a lot about those little things, and it must be that's what's driving it is some property of like the taste distribution and how that connects to those people at the top, and not something from like the inherent talent distribution. Because I think inherent talent distributions tend to be like, I mean, like height is another great example of this. Height is like a classic thin-tailed thing. Like there's just like a normal distribution of height. But like, you know, imagine that and this is maybe not too much of an exaggeration, imagine that basketball skill is just all about height. That's the only thing that really matters. Well then, like suddenly there's like a power law thing because, you know, it's coming out of the fact that you only want those top basketball players, you know. But, yeah, Kevin.
So I think like in sports at least, you can kind of think of it as like the games are almost designed to make the distributions like so like...
skewed?
Yeah.
Fat-tailed?
Because like, just as a basketball example, if they design the games with the baskets like at the knee level or something, like it's not going to make a difference like with the height.
But I still think you'd find something that would like end up mattering, and then those people would be selected out, and you know, in the equilibrium if you had professional sports.
Right, what I'm saying is like sports are kind of the venue where those small differences like they'll be designed in some way that it's like difficult.
Yeah.
So that you know, you're not going to design a sport that's like, I don't know, tossing a tomato into a trash can or something, because like everybody can do that. So, fact that sports are like.
Yeah, it's trying to select out that greatest ability. I mean, running is another thing like this. Like, right, running times are completely thin-tailed distributed, but the amount of money that people who are runners make is incredibly fat-tailed distributed. You know what I mean? I'm going to actually go on because I need to get through this lecture so I don't end up like yesterday, like last time. Okay, so sometimes I think it's plausible to think that entry is durable. So like, for example, reverse engineering and setting up something to imitate. That takes a while to imitate, but once you've imitated, it's like easy to create the thing. Studying for a profession that is in high demand. So it might take a while for people to do that, but once you've learned the stuff, then like lots of people can replicate that. Navigating a regulatory bureaucracy to like enter an industry, that can take a while to do, right? But in other cases, I think it's very unlikely that talent is a durable thing. It's much more likely that people just have it or they don't have it. So like a great athlete, being a great athlete requires investment, but especially at the top, it really just requires having the talent. Like there's really no substitute for that. Adaptability, and innovative capacity are things that are very hard for people to learn or to replicate. And in the internet age, entry happens so rapidly into industries that it's really not something that requires much durable investment. You can easily rent stuff via the cloud. You can, it's very easy to quickly get into an industry. So often time is not the most important element, and sometimes time might even work against entry. So there are times when talent or will to enter an industry might actually be storable rather than durable. Lewis, is Lewis here? No. Does anyone else have an example? You are Miles, right? Yeah. You guys look kind of similar, actually. Yeah.
I think for a lot of, especially college students, like looking for their first job, in terms of how long they're looking for that sort of first experience before going into something else. They don't necessarily want something that's long term. So just actually looking for something for like a year or two.
Yeah, or it could be that there's like a fad for something that will then pass. So I think the most famous example of this is charitable giving. So a disaster-struck region usually gets tons of donations, whereas just a desperately poor region gets much fewer donations. So somewhere that's struck with a disaster for 50 years gets no donations, and somewhere that's struck with a disaster for like 6 months does get donations, right? That's a great example of like effectively entry into charitable giving to those things being storable rather than durable, right? And the short run response in those areas is much greater than the long run response. Industry booms and career paths can be like this. So for example, if there's like a boom in the finance industry, that might actually draw people in more in the short term than the long term, because people might want like a few years of experience in finance, but they might not want to spend their whole lives doing that. Or they might want to go to Alaska for a few years to like mine gold, but they might not want to spend their whole lives as a gold miner. Peace Corps was like that during the 1960s. There was like a big short-term boom in this Peace Corps, but a long-term thing, people wouldn't really want to have spent their whole careers doing that. Starting your own company or living abroad, I think, is another thing like that. If there's like suddenly demand for American entrepreneurs in China, that might have a bigger response in the short term than in the long term, because Americans might not want to live in China for their whole lives, but they might want to go there for a few years to get an experience. Okay, so anyways, I think this all means that the distribution of talent is very important for the nature of rents. But it's not the entire distribution of talent that matters, of course. It's really only the people at the very top, because those are the ones who select into entering into an industry. And a simple way to formalize this is the hazard rate. So if we let capital F be the talent cumulative distribution function of the talent distribution, and little f be its PDF, then is Jackson here? Jackson Jenkins? No? Does anyone want to tell me what the hazard rate is in terms of these things? Yeah, Connor. Yes. Or sorry, what's your name? Oh. Zefeng?
Yeah.
How do you spell that?
Z-E-F-E-N-G.
Oh, Zefeng. Okay, yeah.
So it's defined by the, let's name a letter, just do the lambda x. So the rate at a point of distribution is equals to the probability density of the this point.
Yeah.
And divided by the other probability thereafter. That means
Yes.
the y minus the cumulative probability.
Exactly. Exactly right. So lambda is little f over 1 minus capital F. Ooh, shoot. And this thing increases as x increases if there are thin tails, and it decreases as x gets large if there are fat tails. So some thin-tailed distribution is any distribution that has a bound from above is thin-tailed. It doesn't have a tail. The normal distribution is thin-tailed. Most statistical distributions are thin-tailed. How about some examples of fat-tailed distributions? Winnie, do you know what are some fat-tailed distributions?
T-distributions.
T-distribution, that's a good one. Any other thoughts? Pareto distributions are the most famous, the most fat-tailed. So are log normal distributions. Now, here's a. Let me just see. The way I usually think about thin versus fat-tailed distributions. Well, actually, let me show you these graphs first. So this shows you the distributions with the same mean and variance, but with different types of tails, and it shows you what they look like. So a uniform distribution is very flat. It's just very, very thin-tailed. It's like here, and then it just completely drops off. Normal is a little bit more fat-tailed, but you see it has a tail, but it gets very, very low very quickly. Log normal, on the other hand, it persists much, much longer into the tail. And these show their hazard rates. So the uniform distribution has this very rapidly increasing hazard rate. Normal distribution, somewhat less, but still very rapidly increasing. Log normal actually is a decreasing hazard rate here because it's fat-tailed. Now, the story I usually tell about fat-tailed distributions versus thin-tailed distributions is that really what distinguishes them is the same thing that distinguishes whether you're in an area where the better you get, the more you feel like you're mastering the thing, and the more you feel like no one's really that much better than you, versus an area where the better you get, the more you feel that you're terrible, right? So in something like economics, for example, the better that you get at it, the more you realize that the people who are really good at it are just like way better than you, and that just like keeps going. Like the better you get, the more you realize that you're not as good as the top people, right? That's like a fat-tailed distribution. A thin-tailed distribution is something like typing or like driving, where the better you get at it, the more you feel you sort of mastered it. There's not that much better you could get at it, right? Now, all data we have indicates that the distribution of certain key things, certain notions of talent or accomplishment are extremely fat-tailed. And in fact, they follow a Pareto distribution. And this is so fat-tailed I couldn't even include it in that picture because it was so dramatically decreasing. So in a Pareto distribution, the cumulative distribution function is 1 minus something that follows a power law. That is, it dies off as a power of the size of the thing. Its mean and variance don't even exist if alpha is small enough. And it behaves roughly like log normal until you get very high. So I'll show you. This is the inverse hazard rate, but showing the hazard rate is problematic. So the inverse hazard rate, you'll see until you get here, they're both similar, but then Pareto just completely dwarfs log normal distribution. Miles, what are some ways that came out of the Gebek's article to think about like Pareto distributions?
So just as basically an inverse relationship?
Yes.
In terms of as one grows, there's some sort of relationship with sort of the one set example that's given over and over again with -1.
Yeah.
But basically as one's growing, you get sort of this rapid increase in the other.
Yep.
in a very clear and predictable fashion.
Yeah, that's right. So the one way of doing it is that the fraction of people with talent that's above twice as much talent as the current level you're at is 1/2 to the alpha of the number of people with talent at the above the level that you're currently at. And that's a very slow rate to die off. It's like, the further you go, if alpha was equal to 1, you would only be, like, if you went twice as high talent, there would be half as many people. Very slow rate. You see what I mean? And if alpha is greater, it's dying off more quickly, right? But if alpha is small, it's very small. Another way to put it is that the 5th most talented person is 1/5 to the 1/alpha as talented as the most talented person. So if alpha is equal to 1, that says that the 5th most talented person is 1/5 as talented as the most talented person. The 6th most talented person is 1/6. So you can see that as you get far away from the top, things are like getting much more compressed. It's at the top that things are really spaced out, right? And this alpha equals 1 is Zipf's law. And under Zipf's law, the mean and variance both fail to exist. If you look at the distribution of firm size, and you say the log of the number of employees at the firm against the log of how many firms there are like that, if there's Zipf's law, there should be a slope of -1 here. And that's exactly what you see at the top of the distribution of firms. And in fact, many, 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 many things in the world at the top follow Zipf's law, or at least some form of power law. So for example, CEO pay follows a power law, and so does income overall, with an alpha somewhere between 1.5 and 3. Sometimes this is called the Pareto principle, that 20% of people control 80% of wealth, and you can sort of form a bunch of ratios like that. This also happens for revealed comparative advantage across country. If you look at the distribution of comparative advantage, it tends to follow these types of extreme distributions. So some broad takeaways from this is that talent, income, and other social differences tend to have very large distinctions at the top. And therefore, normal distributions or finite upper bound distributions, when you're talking about like the social impact of things or how important things are socially, tend to way underestimate the upper tail. And any model ignoring this fundamentally misses really key attributes. So for example, if you're thinking about things where it's important how the really wealthy behave, the log normal distribution is actually like way too thin-tailed to match what happens in reality. Heterogeneity is particularly important at the top end of the distribution. At the top end of the distribution, there's going to be much more spaced out distributions of earning or how much talent is recognized, etc. So those selecting into an industry will tend to be even more heterogeneous than the population overall. And this simple empirical regularity of Pareto tails actually does a very good job approximating this behavior, and it's extremely easy to work with this because it has a constant elasticity, and it generates constant elasticity forms, which are really convenient. So Zipf's law is particularly famous for cities. So if you look at the rank of the city against the log of the rank of the city against the log of their population, you get this almost perfect -1 relationship. It also applies to the relative use of different words in the English language. So this type of extreme heterogeneity at the very top raises a lot of important questions that we're going to pursue throughout the rest of the course. So first, it undermines the classic free entry logic in many contexts because it will tend to lead or be a consequence of this type of superstar behavior that we were talking about. It also says that in some sense, free entry is more of an anomaly to the economy than it is the norm. It's actually, in some sense, almost a malfunction of the economy rather than its standard functioning. And intellectual property offers a way really to address that in areas where we happen to have this free entry. And is Julia on here? Yeah, Julia. How does it do that? How does free IP address free entry and restore?
Well, you can sell your IP if you're already distributed to other people. So you can
well, it can help keep other people competing away the profits that you make from invention, right? And so it can that might not be necessary if you are so distinctive that you're able to earn money anyways. Like Apple didn't really need the IP except to keep other people from suing them, but they didn't really need the IP. But in some areas where it's really easy to replicate stuff, you might need the IP to restore that ability to earn profits, right? Another natural question is, if some firms are very large, is Tyler here? Yeah. Is it reasonable to think of them as being price takers, or how should we think about modeling them? What do you think, Tyler? Well, I mean, they probably are going to have market power if they're very large, right? And so Zipf's law suggests that if the norm is that we have this really big spacing out, especially at the top, that we're going to have a lot of market power, and that market power may be a really important thing to consider in our models, right? It'll also tend to lead income distributions to be extremely unequal, which makes potentially redistribution very important. And it also means that raising taxes on the rich can generate a lot of revenue, because there are, at any given level, a lot of people who you get to charge that tax on for every person who's right there, and therefore would reduce the amount that they'll work. And in some sense, these themes that come out of this Pareto distribution at the top are going to summarize a lot of the things we'll talk about throughout the rest of the course. And I'm over, so thanks.